In the Canadian justice system, animals' interests are rarely represented, but the lawyers at Animal Justice fight to give them a voice in court and the political system. This is the Paw and Order Podcast, and these are their stories.
Hello and welcome to episode 3, Paw and Order. I'm Peter Sankoff, University of Alberta, Faculty of Law, and I'm here today with Camille Lapchuk.
Hello, Peter.
How are you?
I'm great. We're in Peter's animal law class right now, which is really, really cool.
Very special episode of Paw and Order. We have been wanting to do a live podcast since we started a month ago. It's been that long. We've been dying to do it,
Well,
but
it's pretty good that we got to it so quickly.
We got to it so quickly. You have never seen so many excited faces. The excitement is palpable. It is literally, I'm looking around the room. Let's hear it from this class. Yes?
Say hi.
Lot of excitement, excited faces. They are literally counting down the minutes till the end of class so that they can get on with their day. No, very excited. I'm pleased to have this special episode. We wanted to do this. Camille is here in Edmonton with me, and I thought it would be a great opportunity. She has just spoken to my class about all the wonderful work that Animal Justice is doing and some of the developments for animals in this country. And we asked my students to provide us with questions that they could ask. They are about to start in on a phase of the course where we discuss animal welfare and animal cruelty laws. So we asked them to put their questions to us, and we will go through as many of their questions as we can. And boy, did they ever come up with some great questions, right, Camille?
Some of these are going to be tough to answer and really made me think. So bravo to you guys.
I'm already scared. So let's start it off with a question from Jesse Chisholm. Jesse, did I get your name right? Chisholm, is that correct? Jesse Chisholm, who asks the following question. Camille, in your opinion, how do you realistically predict that animal welfare law will evolve in future? Will it be by common law or legislative changes that's going to drive it? What do you think, Camille?
Well, I think we're going to see both. I think that for animal lawyers, the right strategy is to go after those issues where society is starting to think about them. Let me give an example. Declawing cats. There's been movement from veterinary societies right now to ban their members from declawing cats. And I think that's obviously really positive because what we know about declawing cats is that it's amputating their fingers, essentially. It's digital amputation. It's not just the claw, it's actually half of their digit that's removed. So I think that society's more aware of this than ever before, and it would be not a super difficult thing to get that enacted into the criminal code or into provincial animal welfare statutes. But I think you could also consider doing that by common law. There are general prohibitions, both in provincial statutes and in the criminal code, against causing unnecessary animal suffering. What does that word unnecessary mean? If it doesn't include cosmetic body modifications to animals, then to me that word is the content of that would be meaningless. So I think there's a great case for marginal cases like that to bring them forward and prosecute under existing laws, in my view.
Yeah, and I love when I get a question that allows me to just jump off into one of my personal bugaboos. But I think if we were to look back on the past 25 years and say what has done more for animals, I think there's no question that there has been more in the area of legislative change. As poor as it's been, there's been more legislative change than court change. And I think that's a real problem. And I think that part of that problem has been sort of a reluctance to bring forward cases that matter. And that's been a recurring theme already in our podcast. And I think it's a recurring theme in this class going forward. The basic problem is that the choices for cases doesn't advance any of the issues that really matter. So what we get are cases that sort of reinforce the status quo. So again, for people who say, well, we need to do more to get tough on abusers. Great, I'm all for getting tough on abusers. But if abusers are the only cases going through the system, there's no way for the common law to have any meaningful influence on the development of the law. So for example, in this class, we talked about the Chilliwack dairy prosecution, which led to a guilty plea, which is great. And people are like, well, this is a big step forward for animals. And I'm like, no, it's really, really not. Because what it does is it essentially punishes the worst types of intentional cruelty, which the law already does well. There is no development. We need better cases to move forward so that we can really influentially bring forward some meaningful change for animals.
And I would just point out, Crown's offices across the country have people who are sitting there on sort of the policy side of things, looking at opportunities and thinking about how they want to expand the law. And I'm not talking about animal cases because they don't typically go down that path for animal cases, but for other criminal law issues, they're constantly trying to consider how they can improve the law and expand it in their favor. And I think that attitude needs to transfer over to animals as well. It doesn't right now.
Okay, let's take a question from Lauren Turner, which talks about a little bit. We talked about this in episode 2. If animals were protected more from suffering under the law, what sort of enforcement regulatory scheme do you think would be most effective to adequately protect them from suffering? So let's do a quick recap of, we talked about this. You students haven't heard it yet in episode 2. What's the answer to that one, Camille?
Okay, well, let's say that there is on the books a reasonably good regulatory statute that protects animals from certain forms of suffering. To have any meaningful oversight over that, you need strong enforcement. And in my view, there's a few hallmarks of strong enforcement. Number one is randomized, frequent inspections. When the industry does not know the inspector is coming, does not have an opportunity to clean up their act, and when it happens frequently enough that they have to constantly be on guard and have to constantly be meeting those standards. Typically at the moment, that does not happen in virtually any industry where there are regulations in place. Number two, I think that the regulatory agency that's doing those enforcements and those inspections needs to be government operated. I think that they need to be transparent and that citizens can access information about what those inspections found, what action was taken, whether there were sanctions imposed for violations. So I would say those are two of the most important hallmarks. Peter?
Yeah, well, for me, it's straightforward. I believe we will start taking animal welfare legislation seriously when we treat it like we treat other forms of crime. It's that simple. I do not believe the SPCAs of this country for all the work that they do, and I'm always going to be... There will be people listening. I'm very hard on the SPCAs. I have nothing against the inspectors of the SPCA who work very hard and really, really care about animals. But with all due respect, as a matter of theory, I don't think you should be doing that job. I don't think it is right to have a private investigatory force that has all the inherent conflicts of a private investigatory force and is not being properly funded by the public interest they are supposed to be serving. You want to make a statement that we care about animals and you really want to enforce it properly? Well, put your money where your mouth is. It's that simple. Either it is a crime or it isn't. Find me another crime in the criminal code that is investigated and to some extent charged or prosecuted by a private force. You can't. It doesn't exist. And there's a reason for that. We don't care enough about animals to bother. And that's, to me, is the biggest change that needs to take place. Okay, let's move on to another question. This is a very specific one, but I'm going to ask to you, Camille, because you raised it in your talk earlier. Camille, what's going on with seal hunting in Canada? Where is the fight, the lines drawn now with seal hunting?
Yeah, great question. So for many, many decades, this practice is actually not decades, centuries, seal hunting has gone on in Canada. It reached a peak, I would say, and within the last 40 years, there have been years where there's over 300,000 seals killed. As a result of markets closing around the world because countries are banning imports of these products, those markets have greatly diminished. So the demand for seal products now is at basically an all-time low, and we're seeing, I can't recall off the top of my head the precise number, but somewhere in the area of 70,000 seals being killed as opposed to 300,000 plus. So it's definitely dropped off to a huge extent. That said, it is still going on. It's still happening because it's a politically popular activity, and there is political support for it in the provinces where people engage in the activity. And governments are very reticent to do anything to regulate or legislate it out of existence because they fear losing those seats in provinces like Newfoundland. So at this point, I think that the seal hunt will end when people in those provinces want it to. It's not something that still makes anyone very much money. It's not a lucrative practice. It happens for a few weeks once a year. No one is relying on this for their full-time income, and it's very, very dangerous work. There are high numbers of injuries and death in this field, so there's lots of reasons to end it. But until people in those communities start asking the government for action, for, say, a buyout, I don't think we're going to see any laws come into place.
It's amazing to me how much it reminds me of, because I'll be blunt again, like I've only been back in Canada for 5-6 years, and most of my work was done in the South Pacific before coming back here. And it's amazing how much the seal hunting reminds me of whale hunting in Japan. It's the same sorts of issues. It's small groups, small communities. There's not really a market for it. There's not really a need for it. Everybody seems to agree on that, and yet we can't move forward out of it. The traditional aspects of it are just viewed as too much of an obstacle to get out of there. Let's deal with a real tough one. When animal welfare laws potentially conflict with rights or freedoms held by Canadians, such as Indigenous rights under Section 35 of the Constitution, or things like religious freedom with kosher slaughter and the like, are these laws more difficult to enforce? How can they be balanced effectively with animal welfare laws?
That is a big one. What we've seen so far in attempts to amend, say, the criminal code for, we've spoken a little bit about it in this class, the attempts to change the criminal code to improve it over the years. And sometimes objections are raised that may affect Indigenous rights. I don't know that they necessarily would, the reforms that have been proposed, but what tends to happen is a non-derogation clause is inserted into that legislation so that nothing in the legislation could be construed to affect existing Indigenous rights. So that's laid out explicitly in the statute. That would be the case anyway, even if it were not laid out, because that right still exists. But I think that animal advocates are very aware of ensuring that Indigenous rights are protected. I would say in general that a lot of Indigenous communities share many of the same attitudes with animal advocates, the attitude of respecting animals, of respecting nature, and not using them simply as resources, but valuing them for who they are. So to me, this is an issue that it doesn't come up very often because it is not as much of a source of conflict as sometimes industries would like to portray it as actually being. I don't know, Peter, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to add on that. I always have a simple answer and a complicated answer. You can just switch out religious freedom or Indigenous rights with another issue where somebody tries to suggest to me that, well, we can't fix this because some small margin will be difficult to deal with. So the example I like to give is whenever I'm talking with somebody about vegan uses or something, I'll get a question about, well, what about medical experimentation to cure cancer? It's the same idea. It's a small end of the wedge versus the big problem. And my answer to that is usually I have the flippant answer and then the more serious answer. My flippant answer is like, look, you want to give up farming, I will give you medical experimentation. Like, that's just me. And I realize, there are lots of people who wouldn't, but that's sort of a serious answer, a joking answer that I use as a way of forcing us to refocus on what's actually going on here, meaning that the Indigenous population and the exercise of their rights to hunt and fish and et cetera are not really the scope of the problem that I'm trying to deal with. And I'm not diminishing harm that they might do to animals, but I'm just saying, let's keep this in perspective. So that's number one.
Yeah, and just to add to that really quickly, numbers-wise, 771 million animals were killed on farms in Canada in 2015 alone. And when you think about the number of animals who are hunted, I mean, the entire number of animals in this country would be somewhere less than, I believe, 10 million. And those hunted by Indigenous people would be even less than that. So when you look at those two numbers, you see one is a big problem, one's a small problem.
Right. So it's not a complete answer to the question. It's just what I'm trying to say is we have to remember to keep these things in perspective when we're discussing the scope of the problem that's involved there. So what I mean is if we can't solve that particular problem for quite some period of time, I'm not really that concerned about it. And I feel the same way about the religious freedom aspect. The way to deal with questions of religious freedom is the exact same way we deal with any other question where there's an infringement on religious freedom. We try and decide whether the countervailing objectives are serious enough that despite the fact that it infringes on religious freedom, we need to make limitations. And for example, if there were decisions, for example, like if somebody wanted to resuscitate, for example, ancient religious practice of ritual slaughter of animals in the streets, that I don't think today we would accept that. I think we would say that our public order laws, et cetera, are contrary to these particular religious fractums. So you don't see Orthodox Jewish groups slaughtering rams in the street anymore, even though that was a religious practice, because it wouldn't be permitted. So I think that there are ways to think about, balancing objectives against religious freedom. And is that complicated? Of course it's complicated. It's no more or less complicated than any balancing test we have to do when you're balancing competing objectives with constitutional rights. But a great question. Thank you so much for it. We've gotten this in a couple of questions. So more than one student wants to know, what are some examples of strong animal welfare laws in other parts of the world? Well, you go ahead. I got something to say on that.
Okay, well, I think we can learn a lot from different systems in other countries. None of them are great.
None.
None, not a single one.
You jumped on my answer, Camille.
Sorry.
I love to answer that question with like, who's doing it right? Who's really got the message? And the answer is no one has it right.
No one has it right, but a lot of them have it a lot better than Canada. I can tell you that.
Yes.
So, for instance, some countries have national animal welfare legislation that sets out standards for animal care and use and regulations that pertain to those. We don't have that. That's in part a quirk of our federalism system, which is a whole other issue. But we would be better off, in my view, if we did have something like that. That's one example. There's an article recently that appeared in the New York Times about how the Netherlands has a national animal police force. That was something formed as part of political discussions about a coalition government. It was a negotiating point, and one party forced another party to accept that. And now they have this national animal police force. It is a police force where regular police members receive special training and they go and deal with animal cases. They're not an inspection agency. They don't inspect farms or industries in the same way, but they do deal with animal issues, companion animal issues, domestic animal issues. And I think that system is much better than what we have in Canada.
And I think like there's a lot of ways to answer that. And I think there are some countries that are just better, relatively speaking, than we are. But honestly, you could cobble together pieces of legislation from the world, and you would probably come pretty close to creating a good, certainly anti-cruelty law, and certainly a much better welfare law. If I took pieces from every jurisdiction, in fact, to be honest, if I took the 10 Canadian provinces and cobbled together the best parts of each law, you'd get something that's a lot closer to where we want to go than where we actually are. And I could go through a number of examples. For example, just to throw some out, for example, I mean, I lived in New Zealand for quite some time, and I think the New Zealand Animal Welfare Act, while it has many flaws, has so many features that are better than any aspect of Canadian law. And I'll just throw out three, just to throw them out. One is, while it is symbolic, they still provide inherent recognition for great apes, which is one of the few pieces of legislation in the world that actually says you cannot do something to a great ape unless it's in the great ape's interests. Well, that's a huge symbolic and important statement. Two, it has stratified offenses, which we don't have. We have one offense, willful cruelty. They have stratified offenses that are very similar to the offenses that we have against humans. So one of the things we do for humans is we recognize that there are different types of harm and there are different levels of criminal offending with those harms. So you don't just have murder, you have manslaughter, you have aggravated assault, you have assault causing bodily harm, you have assault. Those types of gradations are really important. You might not think that, but they are. They're important for things like plea bargaining. They're important for things like recognizing different severity. We don't have that. We have willful cruelty. So the absolute worst of the willful cruelty and the absolute most minimal of the willful cruelty are identical, except for sentencing purposes. And again, you might think, who cares? It's a big deal. It really does matter, because what happens is eventually you only start to punish the worst of the worst, and the other things disappear as offenses entirely. Whereas in New Zealand, the range of offenses allows investigators to be much more careful about what it is that they're actually doing. I could go on. There are 3 or 4 other features of that legislation and some others. The UK legislation has some really good things in that it tries to actually measure what cruelty is. We don't do that. And there are lots of examples you can go from around the world that could be useful to us in the future. Another topic for a future podcast. How about that, Camille? Around the world with animal cruelty. That'd be something fun to do.
That'd be fun.
Okay, let's get into a different topic. Well, this is one we've already talked about a little bit. What are some, this is from Janae Lewis, what are some pros and cons of humane societies operating independently of each other? I'm looking forward to the pros of that, Camille. What, if any, structural changes could be made to improve their efficacy in protecting and benefiting animals? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll deal with the second one first. And, I think one major issue facing citizens right now when we want to oversee the enforcement of our laws is that we don't have a lot of information. There's no statistics per province or nationally on prosecutions in this country, on their outcomes, on how many investigations were conducted compared to how many charges were actually laid. We have a real deficit of information. And that's in part because this information isn't compiled in some cases, but other times it is compiled by these private organizations, but isn't released because it's kept with them. And sometimes the courts have the information and they don't. So I guess all that goes back to this point of transparency and how can we as citizens oversee this democratic function of law enforcement when we don't have that information. So that's a huge issue to me. There's also usually fewer complaint mechanisms available for somebody who perceives that there's an issue with law enforcement. When private charities aren't subject to police accountability legislation in the same way that the RCMP or another police force would be, that becomes a problem for us as well. And Peter, I don't know if you have any pros you can mention because I'm at a loss.
I'm still struggling with the pros, but I wanted to throw out my favorite con. Whenever I think about this problem, I don't actually think this way. So this is going to sound really facetious, but I'm going to do it anyway because that's what I do. But I always used to say, I don't actually think it was designed this way. But like, honestly, if you wanted to design an ineffective system to regulate a particular area, like this is the one you've come up with individual groups all operating on their own with distinct budgets and no national planning campaign. And they don't really talk to each other or share information or ideas. And that's not entirely true. The SPCAs do get together. They do try to do this, but it's very, very difficult. It is not their only or exclusive domain. They are a charity that shelters animals. That's what they do. So it is very, very difficult to create a system. And by the way, forget about the SPCA. The animal protection network is fragmented even further. We have like the SPCA is not doing it nationwide, as we already said. Like it's Manitoba who's bowed out. Manitoba and parts of Saskatchewan have bowed out of the SPCA framework. So they're just out, right? So there's no longer a cohesive unit. And then, of course, in the farm area, we have the CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and there are other groups doing aspects of animal welfare protection. So we just do not have a cohesive way of thinking about this. And if you want to design a system that doesn't work, make it as non-cohesive as possible.
And I'll say two other issues that arise from that, because there are so many different agencies tasked with enforcing one little piece of animal protection laws. If you're a citizen and you see something wrong and you want to make a complaint about animal cruelty, it's very difficult for you to know where to turn. One of the biggest issues that animal justice deals with is just trying to help people find out where to report animal cruelty. We're actually creating a smartphone app for this very purpose to try to make that easier for people. And then the final thing I would say is the funding problem. These are organizations that are forced to fundraise to be able to pay for their operating costs to do the public work of law enforcement. And you would not see that in any other system. And frankly, it's awful.
It was absolutely brutal. I used to cover this in New Zealand. I wrote an editorial in the paper about how there were New Zealand SPCA offices. They're like, look, we can't do any prosecutions anymore. Like, we're just out for a while because we don't have enough money. Our shelter's taking up all our costs. It was crazy. I'm not kidding. What I used to say, you can do that here too if you're charged indictably. In New Zealand, it was a little worse because the SPCAs actually had to run the trials as well. So they were the prosecutors as well. So I used to say to every defendant, I'm like, if I'm a defendant, I'm choosing a jury trial every time. Like, I will always want a jury trial because I just want to drag the proceeding out because I know the prosecutor can't afford it. And it's not quite the same here, but there are investigative problems as well. The SPCA, I've heard from many members of the SPCA who are doing investigations, the more complex the case, the less likely they are to handle it. It's simply the more expensive it is, the more animals they have to hold. That's a huge issue. Anytime there are multiple victims and the animals have to be held for trial, it's an incredible burden on the SPCA to actually hold them.
Especially if they're large animals like horses or cows. I mean, a couple birds is one thing, or a cat, but when you're talking about multiple large animals, that's very pricey.
Not a lot of birds. Just ask the Montreal SPCA. They had to do a major bird trial. Oh my God, we'll have our friends from the Montreal SPCA on soon to talk about that. Okay, we could go on all day. We want to get to a few more questions here. John McMullen asks, what causes producers to promote animal welfare? So why do animal industries promote animal welfare? Are the causes economic, regulatory, in response to activism, as a result of activism by industry, or something else?
Well, I would say a little bit of each of those comes into play, but the biggest factor is that industries change when they believe that there is a profit reason to do so. Let me give you the best recent example of this that I can think of. The Vancouver Aquarium announced in January that it would no longer keep whales and dolphins at its facility. And it was a surprise announcement. None of us saw this coming, but the reason that they made this announcement was not because they had a change of heart about their long-standing, decades-long policy of confining whales and dolphins in tiny tanks. It's that they were losing funding. They were losing major donors, and they were losing revenue at the door because the public has gotten to a point where we just don't want to see these majestic animals swimming around in circles in tiny tanks anymore. And when they start to feel that in their bottom line, they are going to make changes. But to go back to the other parts of that question, there were regulatory issues as well, and there were standards coming. So there's a national bill right now before the Senate of Canada that would ban keeping whales and dolphins across the country. And Vancouver itself, as a city, had just banned the aquarium from doing so. It's fighting that in court, so there's still some hope, I guess, from them that they might win. But you see a few things here. There's citizen pressure, there's regulatory changes in response, so the law changes, and then there's the profit motive that these industries have to actually change their minds. So I would say that those things all contribute, but ultimately industries only choose to change if they think they're going to gain or lose money from doing so.
Okay, well, my answer is a little bit more nuanced than that, and partly because it's very difficult to put industry in one box. It's a real wide group of people with a real wide group of interests. So I'm very careful to say my experience has been, and all the things I've been doing in reading the material, that to begin with, even amongst producers, there are different levels of caring about animals. You know what I mean? So it's very difficult to put everybody in one box. There will be farmers operating farms in some areas who do it with a deep love of animals. That's different than mine. I don't want to kill the animals I love, but nonetheless, they approach their job every day with a real reverence for the animals they work in. So I don't want to dismiss that. I think that does exist, and I think there is a different level, right down to the complete opposite. There are producers, I have read detailed accounts of this, so this is like literally people, and as well as met them, who don't care. They see the animals as units of production. So we have to be careful about sort of projecting uniformity when I don't think some exists. Then the second thing I'd add to this, though I agree with what Camille has said, is what I've learned in my encounters with various players in industry is one of the problems they have is that they view the very idea of welfare differently from, say, we do, leaving aside the killing angle entirely. So let's assume for the moment that Camille and I are quite happy for animals to die so long as they're living wonderful lives. Let's just assume that for the purposes of this conversation. Camille didn't look well when I did that. Sorry, Camille. I gave Camille a bit of a heart attack.
I can deal with the thought experiment.
Okay, it's a thought experiment. Let me be very clear before we get the hate mail on Twitter from some of our followers. As a thought experiment, let's assume, right, that we're perfectly happy to do that so long as they're living wonderful lives right up to that blessed moment when they enter a blessed light room chamber and everything just goes out suddenly with no pain whatsoever. Okay, let's assume that exists. Now, even there's a real distinction that I found in the agricultural community with what it means for welfare. That's a real question. And what I've learned is that to the industry, or a lot of members of the industry, welfare means that the animal is healthy, and the focus is on health. And for members of the animal advocacy community, health is not my exclusive concern. So for me, the example, and by the way, when I say health, they mean physical health. So for example, it may well be, and I've seen them, by the way, so I know they exist. I've seen some of the modern, say, sow stall farms, right, where they actually do a fair bit to ensure that the sows in the stalls are not physically being harmed, right? So the cages are different, there's a little more space, et cetera, et cetera. To those farmers, they were happy to show those images because to them, those are healthy. They're healthy animals. And to us, we have a very different view of what health means because we're looking more as well, leaving aside the ultimate death. That's all fine. The breeding is fine. The actual continued exploitation of the pregnancies. Sorry, I'm not doing that. I assumed for the purpose of this that was okay. We're also very concerned about what the animals are going through. So I do think there are distinctions between what it means to promote animal welfare, which was at the heart of John's question. Like, what do? Well, they promote animal welfare because they do think consumers care about the health of the animals. And I'm willing to accept that a lot of them themselves want the animals to be healthy. I don't think there are some, but I don't think the majority of producers want their animals to be sick, want their animals to be limping, want their animals to suffer. Some do. I think some are very indifferent to it or willing, but I don't think they all do. So anyway, that was a big answer to a question, but I wanted to get some of those thoughts out. Okay, Amanda Sarrazin Gould asks us a question that I liked. With so many different issues in animal welfare and the broad polarizing effect of these issues, it's true. Some issues are straightforward, but many polarized. She raises issues about research, animals in captivity, veterinarian malpractice. Is there a conscious effort being made to avoid alienating members of the public who may not necessarily exemplify the behaviors or make the choices that animal advocates believe they ought to? Us moralizing animal advocates, Amanda, we are terrible people. I have been moralizing in this class since day one, telling all of you to lift your game. I actually have not been doing that, but let's assume I have. Camille, what do you think? I think one of the things she's getting at is that clash, which any of us doing this work have run into. It's one of the ways it was put to me is, can you have non-vegans in your group? That was one of the way it was put. And for some people, that's a real issue. Some groups will not allow non-vegans in. Sorry, those groups. We do allow lots of non-vegans in, and I think we're happy to work with anybody. Is that right, Camille?
That is right, Peter. We want to build a broad coalition of people who care about animals. And humans, frankly, we're notoriously...
Sell out. Oh, sorry. Was that me, Camille?
Hey.
I apologize.
Humans are notoriously bad at aligning our beliefs with our behavior. It's a quirk of human nature. There's a lot of psychological reasons for that I won't get into. But I don't think that you can exclude people whose values don't always align with every single action on that basis, because you're not going to build the broad public support you need for animal protection if you do. Let's just think about this issue briefly in the political context. What motivates politicians to take action on an animal issue? Oftentimes it's because they fear losing support if they don't, because their constituents will be angry with them, or they see an opportunity to gain support if they do take action. So sometimes it's opportunism. If there aren't enough people in their constituencies who say that they care about animals, I mean, we're so far behind that that's really difficult to catch up. Now, how many people, in Canada are actually vegan? The stats show it might be like 2-3% and maybe 5% more who are vegetarian. But when you ask people if they want stronger animal cruelty laws, 95% of people say that they do. So it's not that it's just the vegans who have to be active and lobbying their politicians to make change. It's that we all do. People who are compassionate in other ways need to make their voices known if we're going to get any legal change. So I don't think that it would be productive at all to exclude people from this movement because they're not perfect yet.
Well said, Camille. I'll let you take the grief on that one. I'm staying out. Let's move on to another question.
I'm sure we'll get hate mail.
Oh, I have no doubt. The animal rights community, lovely, lovely people, but, I'll stop there. Okay, moving right along. For legal development in favor of animal rights, related question. For legal developments in favor of animal rights, positive pop culture and social consensus are must-haves. I'm a believer in social consensus. How can we lead the law to regulate treatment of animals when the majority of animals are absent from people's lives and pop culture? How can we develop empathy for animals if there's no awareness of their existence? It's a great question. There are a number of researchers who work on that angle alone. My friend Siobhan O'Sullivan in Australia. Shout out, Siobhan, if you're listening. You're probably not listening, Siobhan, but shout out to you anyway. It does some work on this, and she's a big believer in openness and transparency. And there are a number of theorists who have posited that the removal of animals for our lives is what's led to them being in factories. It's a co-modified process. Essentially, the more that we put them out of our sight, the more we put them out of our mind. And it's amazing. Like I used to talk, I talk to my kids about this a lot because I'm raising them in that way. But we lived in a farming community in Germany. My wife's family are farmers, and we live in a farming community in Germany. And the truth of the matter is, it's almost impossible to see animals anymore, with the exception of cattle, which graze. Cattle graze, but try finding pigs, chickens, non-grazing animals. It's very difficult to find them, and that's one of the reasons that there's a lot of people who've written about chickens saying the reason why chickens have become commodified in the way that they have. And to be honest, let's get this straight. The worst treated animal on the planet is the chicken. That's the reason why, because we're able to shield them from our sight.
That's right. And there are a lot of people working to counter this by doing various things. There's undercover investigations that have sprung up. This is a more recent phenomenon, seeing them really everywhere these days, and especially in Canada. But we've now seen inside chicken farms, we've seen inside turkey farms and slaughterhouses, pig transport situations, roadside zoos, laboratories in Canada. And when people see that footage, when it comes out and it's aired on CTV or another national news station, people are shocked because they don't realize what's going on because that information has been kept from them. Industries obviously have a really strong incentive to hide this from them. And then there's other organizations like We Animals, a terrific photographer named Joanne MacArthur. She's the subject of a great documentary called The Ghost in Our Machine. And she dedicates her life to going into situations and photographing animals so people can see what their lives are like. This might be in zoos, it might be in farms, it might be aquariums, it's research facilities, it's anywhere that we are. But those images are very popular and powerful because because it's unexpected. We don't often have a very good idea of what's going on. So I think to really answer the question of how we can make social change when their lives are absent from ours, I think that social media is playing a really big role in telling people what is going on. We did not have the ability to reach people in the same way 15 years ago, before Facebook, before Instagram, before YouTube. And that's changed a lot. And I think that the rise in animal interest, the rise in animal news stories is related very strongly to our ability now to see them in ways that we never could before.
All right, I'm going to finish off today because we're coming to the end of class time. We actually have a lot more wonderful questions, but I'll finish off with an appropriate one. What can the average Canadian do to help advance animal welfare laws in this country?
This is my favorite question.
Mine too. I love it. That's why I kept it for the end.
We might have different answers
too. It's an anonymous sender, so I can't name the person who asked that wonderful question.
So I mentioned earlier the importance of building a broad political movement and the importance of reaching out to your legislators. For average members of the public who aren't lawyers and can't fight these cases in court, what you can do is develop a personal relationship with your city councillor, with your provincial representative, and with your federal MP, and tell them that you care about animal issues and want to see action. Oftentimes what you see is some very strong voices in legislatures and councils and parliament, and these aren't people necessarily who are huge animal lovers themselves, but they've heard from a few constituents who've convinced them of the importance of these issues. So you as one individual, or if you grab a few friends and have a meeting with your representatives, can have a huge, huge difference. And frankly, before we get significant political change for animals, we need people doing this across the country with every single legislator. So it's a big task ahead of us, but it's something that's very doable, very achievable for your average person.
And I'm going to go, that's a really good answer, but I'm going to go a little bit more personal and keeping it to yourself. First and foremost, what can the average Canadian do? Well, they can start by caring. I mean, first of all, I honestly believe that the average Canadian either does not care, or perhaps that's not fair because of the stats that you've given, Camille, but does not manifest that caring in any way that really matters. And whatever that way is for you, it's important. I believe, to go back, that the choices that you make in your own life are influential and have an existence that have a ramification beyond your own life. So whether that is the choices that you make or simply the life that you live, and I mean that either by the choices you make or the willingness you are to discuss these issues with other people. You guys are in this class. The average Canadians have a voice to say in this as well. So being politically active is one thing. I believe that what has made animal welfare more topical is the fact that more people are talking about it, more people are caring about it. And what has made changes in the industry, as we already talked about in the last question, is the fact that the industry may suffer if it doesn't adapt its ways to fix what Canadians think is important. And the only way to do that, I believe, is through the market and through the choices that we make individually. So I believe that every Canadian has a role to play and honestly has an obligation towards animals and can do something different. Really, whether they do so or not is really whether they care. So to me, caring is the first step. That was very meta. I think we
very meta.
Did we win a few of the animal rights people back on board with that answer?
Oh, we might get some hate mail.
It's hard to say. Care, people, just care. On that note, we will end with a loving message of caring, and everybody is happy. I want to thank my animal law class for I've held them 2 minutes beyond the time. They're going to be upset with me, but I appreciate you or your willingness to be involved in this project. We're very excited about it, and thanks, Camille, for coming in today and being part of our episode 3. Thank you to all of you, and thanks to our listeners. We look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Paw and Order.
Paw and Order.
Paw and Order.
Thanks to our listeners for tuning in today. You can subscribe to the Paw and Order podcast using iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or your favorite podcatcher. Please consider helping others find it too by leaving us a rating and a review to boost our rankings. We encourage you to share the podcast on social media so that others can enjoy it. If you liked today's episode of Paw and Order, please also consider making a donation to Animal Justice, which makes all of this possible. You can find Peter on Twitter at @PeterSankoff and visit his law professor website, petersankoff.com. You can find me on Twitter at Camille Labchuk, that's LABCHUK, and we always enjoy Twitter back and forth about the show or other animal law or political topics. Thanks so much to producer Shannon Milling and music composer Kevin Lacroix for the intro.